So prior to working with NPRB, I was working with Wayne and with others at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and I thought I'd follow Wayne's talk by talking about some of the work that he referenced related to how some of the bias that might be in the data if you're using survey data to understand ecosystems. And Wayne had suggested, particularly for things like rockfish that are associated with hard substrates, the bottom trawl survey isn't able to get into some of those areas. And so there's a potential to overestimate some species potentially and underestimate other species. In any case, you're not looking at the whole ecosystem. And so one of the studies that we've been working on, several different scientists are working on different elements of this, is to try and quantify and identify what is trawlable versus untrawlable habitat, and how might that influence how we think about the system from an ecosystem perspective, and then also from a species-specific management perspective. So there's a few different questions that we might ask in terms of how species are distributed and how that can factor into effective management. One is how they're distributed, and are there some thresholds where they respond to certain environmental variables. So we can apply spatial mapping of abundance and variation of abundance to get at that. We can look at some of the critical thresholds. Second question is, then how do you integrate that knowledge into stock assessment models? So we can use environmental correlates to look at deviations in stock recruitment and try and figure out, can we clean up some of these relationships that we have between the spawning stock size and recruitment or the production of the next generation of fish. We can also estimate how habitat volume, certain habitats might shrink or expand given different shifts in the climate, and use that to project forward with models. And then finally, there's this question that I started with, which is how do you account for bias or potential bias in the data that you have? So these surveys are intended to be fisheries independent surveys with the idea that fisheries dependent data, which is also useful, has its own bias in the sense that fishermen are trying to typically catch particular types of species and minimize their bycatch of others. So we know that particular species and particular life stages have strong habitat associations, and not all of that habitat is available through our standard sampling, which is the bottom trawl gear that Wayne had introduced before. So if we look at our system around Alaska, I'm going to just focus on the Bering Sea for a minute as an example. This is the Bering Sea shelf, the areas that's surveyed, and this is showing temperature over time with temperature between, for 5 years in a warm period from 2001 to 2005 on the left, and then during a cold period. So what you see is in the cold period, you have the intrusion of what's called the cold pool. This is waters defined as either less than 0 or alternatively less than 2 degrees centigrade. And you see that cold pool extent changes pretty dramatically in warm versus cold phases and year to year as well. And that has some effects over where certain fish are found. If we take a depth temperature look at the Bering Sea shelf, this is depth of the bottom, not the depth within the water column. We can separate out the Bering Sea shelf into an inner domain that's generally warmer temperatures, which is 0 to 50 degrees bottom depths, then the middle domain, which is typically where this cold intrusion of water that's a legacy of sea ice sits. So that middle domain between 50 and 100 meters, that middle shelf is actually the coldest area in the Bering, and then relatively warmer again in the outer domain. And then we can look at how different species distribute across the system viewed in this way. So this is looking at Pacific cod and Pacific halibut. Both of these species, particularly cod, are pretty evenly distributed across different temperature ranges and different depth ranges. But that's different when you look at some other species. So if you look at arrow-toothed flounder and Greenland turbot, they're both found typically at depth, so more than 100 meters in depth. And then they also segregate out by temperature. So arrow-toothed flounder are found between 2 and 4 degrees centigrade. Greenland turbot are found in colder temperatures between 0 and 2 centigrade. And then if you look within a species, for instance in pollock where we have a lot of data, you'll see that at different life stages, they're also going to be using the system differently. So you have juvenile pollock in the inner domain, or the inner nearshore parts of the shelf, in the shallow areas, and then as they get to be adults, they move into the middle and outer domain of the shelf. So understanding how these species will shift over time is important. If you look at arrowtooth flounder here, the distribution in those warm years on the left versus the cold years, you also have a species that is typically found at depth, but that's largely due to some temperature constraints. And so as you get warmer temperatures, a certain portion of the stock moves into those shallower areas and has an overlap with certain other fish, including forage fish and juvenile pollock. We can take, using ordination, we can take these survey stations that are shown in the map on the right and look at how they distribute according to a range of different habitat variables, such as depth or temperature or substrate coarseness, and use this to overlay where certain species are found according to these physical attributes of the system. So I'll just show 3 sessile or relatively sessile invertebrates. So we have scallops, which are found at depth and in a certain range of temperatures. Mussels you find in very shallow depths and generally in coarser substrates where they're fixed to rock and other hard substrates. And then clams, which are again in shallow areas, but then in substrates that are unconsolidated, so sand and mud and gravel. So this allows us to look at sort of how species are responding to a suite of different environmental variables, all in unison, rather than just looking at how they respond to one particular variable. So if we're looking at stock assessment models, one of the metrics that's estimated typically is catchability, and that's really a function of 2 different attributes. One is selectivity. There's a whole suite of studies being done by NOAA, ADF&G, and others looking at how selective gears are. So do you have gears that funnel fish and center them into the net? Do you have gears that scatter them out? Are there certain things that are going through or going above or beyond or underneath the net? And then you also have availability. So the availability of the species for capture. Certain species like cod will be moving vertically within the water column with different temperatures, so you may be missing them in certain environmental conditions. Others like crab are often up and mobile in warmer temperatures, so they're up on their legs, they get swept into the net, whereas in colder environments they may be hunkered down and you might actually have the foot rope bounce over them and you won't actually see them in the catch. So there's the availability of the species to capture, and then also the availability of a certain type of habitat to capture, which is really what we're getting at with the untrawlable habitat. So the survey data is used as our major fisheries independent data source. So that's on distribution, provides information on relative abundance, and then also a suite of life history parameters and biological interactions and ecosystem structure. So given that we have some limitations about where we can sample, it's important to try and figure out how limiting that is and in what ways. So we were using some of the digitized coverages that Mark Zimmerman had put together that Wayne showed before. This is the National Oceanographic Service hydrographic smooth sheet data that have been digitized. And then looking at what habitat is available to these bottom trawl surveys. So here's our system. Mark's ground truth or processed the digitized smooth sheets for 2 systems, the Gulf of Alaska and the Aleutians, as well as some areas in Norton Sound, and I believe in the Chukchi as well. I'm going to show results from the Gulf of Alaska because that's where we started, and then move into the Aleutians where we're starting to apply some of the same methods. So you can use this data to just the smooth sheet data alone, which is shown in the top graph, or combined data sets that include multi-beam surveys and other data in the bottom. And you can use that to produce maps of different bathymetric metrics, features. So slope, which is steepness, benthic terrain, which helps define some of the gullies and the finer scale topography. Curvature, there's a variety of different types of curvature. We looked at 4 different types. That's really looking at how convex or concave, according to different dimensions, the habitat is. Vector ruggedness, which is a form of roughness of the surface. Aspect, which is the compass direction that a particular slope is facing, and that had some implications for how currents move through the system. And then this is for the full system looking at rugosity and vector ruggedness. These are similar metrics. Rugosity is looking at the surface area over the planar area, so how rough the system is. And vector ruggedness is looking at the same thing but in a different way. So looking at what the relationship is for a certain point to the points in the neighborhood around it. Both are looking at roughness of the surface. And then we can also use the smooth sheet data as well as other data available to look at sediment. So consolidated sediment and then grain size. This is showing the fee size or the grain size of sediments. So darker colors are showing gravel and rock. Mid colors are showing various types of sand, and then the lightest colors are showing silt and mud. And then we can look at where did the survey trawl paths actually overlay over time. And so it's hard to see individual tracks, but these are back calculated to where the net was actually on the bottom. The green, they're lines, they look sort of like dots from here, but are successful trawls, and then the red are the unsuccessful trawls. And we also have data on survey stations. So for each station, it's designated as either trawlable or untrawlable based off of the past performance. And so we looked at trawlable and untrawlable habitat according to both of these 2 scales, so on towpaths and then within stations. And what we found is that untrawlable habitat was associated with increased depth, with increased slope, rugosity, vector ruggedness, and curvature, as well as with coarser sediments. But we found that which were the sort of limiting factors depended on where you were within the system. So different areas had different combinations of attributes limiting whether or not it was trawlable. So just looking at some of the statistics for this, this is showing depth in all these plots. These are box plots showing the distribution of survey stations according to a specific variable. On the left you have trawlable areas in the white. In the middle you have the untrawlable stations, and then the darkest color on the far right is those that are unknown, so they're stations that are unknown. So what we found, what you'll see across all these graphs are that typically trawlable stations had less depth, less steepness, less rugosity. Untrawlable had more, and we had the greatest variation in those unknown stations, so that suggests that it'd be useful to look more carefully at some of those unknown stations, and what we're trying to do is use this analysis to help predict whether or not those unknown stations would be trawlable or untrawlable. So you can look at this at the towpaths as well. So this is true when you look not only at the mean depth, but the standard deviation or the variance in depth, with the slope, with current, with the presence of large rocks that are noted. With the bathymetric position index, you see some deviation between untrawlable and trawlable. That's true of both rugosity and vector ruggedness. We see that with sediment here, negative numbers are associated with more coarser substrates, so that's why you see the shift in the relationship here where the untrawlable is lower. It refers to more coarse substrates. And then that was true across 4 different measures of curvature as well. And so we used these outputs and applied a model. This is a random forest model that was looking at what is the marginal importance of one single predictor on determining whether or not a certain area is trawlable or not. And we took that relationship, which looks at trawlability on the vertical axis against a range of metrics on the horizontal axis. Here we have depth, maximum depth, standard deviation of depth, I believe, and slope. And then we fit a split regression line to look at where do you have some breakpoints in that relationship and what's the variation or the confidence interval around where that breakpoint is. And can we use those breakpoints where, say, at a certain depth we really don't have, or a certain steepness we don't have trawlable area, can we use that to predict in areas that we haven't surveyed what might be trawlable or untrawlable? So we did that for a range of depth, slope, again, our typical metrics, BPI, ruggedness, and rugosity, curvature. And then on the bottom, we also looked at a range of other variables that weren't predictive, but just more descriptive. So we looked at longitude and latitude, and what we found is that it was trawlable in the Gulf in the middle longitude, and in the highest latitudes, that happens to be the same thing. So it's essentially the middle part of the Gulf, which is also the northern part of the Gulf, was areas where we had the most trawlable habitat. We had coarser substrates on the east and the west, and some current interactions as well. And then we also looked at the perimeter and the area of the survey station, because not all, even though we have a fixed grid, where you have a square station that is intersected by a survey line, that square becomes somewhat reduced. And so we wanted to account for the fact that not all survey stations are the same size, and you're more likely to not find a place where you can put a bottom trawl net down if you have a smaller area to work with. So we used that, we integrated that to develop a map of estimated untrawlable habitat. And so that led to areas really along the shelf, a lot of rocky habitat in the far eastern Gulf and around the northern end and southern end of Kodiak Island, some current effects through Shelikof Strait, and some sediment in other areas throughout the middle part of the shelf, some gullies and so on that were difficult to get a net to stay on the bottom. This is that same map, although the trawlable and untrawlable habitat is shaded according to probability of whether or not it's trawlable. And here we overlaid the survey stations in green. And then we did the same thing overlaying the untrawlable survey stations here in red on the bottom. And what you see is there's really several core areas that are highlighted here that are untrawlable. And again, it's around Kodiak Island, a few areas around the peninsula, all along the slope, and then in the southeast. And each of those areas are somewhat different. So along the shelf break, it was due to shelf and curvature as the limiting factors. In the mid-shelf, it was mostly sediment, and then ruggedness and curvature in certain places in the mid-shelf as well. So in the Aleutians, we're just starting to apply this approach here. We have these different management regions that Wayne had outlined. This shows the survey strata, and then within that, the survey stations. And so, you know, we have this standard bathymetry, which gives us a fairly good index of the depth. But with Mark's data, we have a really much higher resolution look at what the bottom looks like. So this is looking at 2.1 million soundings across this area and 25,000 sediment observations. So it's a real wealth of data that's going to be improved by some of the nearshore work that he's doing. And that gives us a much more refined map of the bathymetry with a higher resolution. And we can use that then to look at you know, shaded reliefs or different structure in the system. You can develop estimates of slope, of aspect. And then we can take each of these layers and then reduce them to just the areas that are within the survey grid that are of interest. So this is looking at aspect just within the survey area. We also have a lot of sediment data. We have two different suites of sediment data outside of the smooth sheets, and then combined with the smooth sheets, we can develop some sediment maps. Here, the gray is looking at core substrates, rocky habitat. The browns are mud, and then the tan are different grain sizes of sand. And then again, we can reduce that to look at where you have different types of habitat within the survey grids in the Aleutians. And then overlay on that the actual towpath. So these are the towpaths from the 2016 data that were in the system. This is the survey paths over the last 10 years of sampling. And so we're looking to apply the same suite of analyses and then ultimately look at how does that trawlable and untrawlable habitat line up with our species distributions or the estimates from the survey, such as for Acca mackerel or Pacific cod or some other species, and look at whether or not we have some bias and where and for which species. And so the further application for these analyses is to inform not just how we use the data, but survey design for the bottom trawl survey. Identify some areas where we might want to apply a different type of sampling. So instead of bottom trawls, using acoustics or video transects or some automated image analysis. Looking at species distributions, as I suggested, to look at where we have some bias there. And improving some models, and then also informing habitat models that might be related to other issues such as corals or other important habitat. In the Aleutians, what we're trying to do is then apply the model that we have used in the Gulf, compare areas that are designated as either closed to fishing or critical habitat, and then look at if this information can help understand some of the oceanography and flow in the region as well. So that's it. Thanks. Maybe I'll take one or two questions.
So has the data you collected over the years and whatnot done significant amount of work in projecting those potential areas or understanding those areas in comparison to like biomass disturbed?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So that's slightly different than what we were looking at in terms of whether or not bottom trawls are actually having a negative disturbance on habitat. There is a lot of work that's been done towards that. And I want to reiterate that, I mean, this data, I was analyzing the data, but this data is collected through years and hundreds of people through Alaska Fisheries Science Center and others. So the data has been used in a wide variety of areas. There is some work looking at the impacts of bottom trawl impacts on habitat and corals and so on. Yeah, and Wayne would be a great person to talk to on that. Some folks in his team are looking at those questions.